Hello, everyone, and welcome to our webinar today on sharing clinical trial results with participants. It is such a pleasure to welcome you on International Clinical Trials Day. We couldn't have a better day to be hosting this webinar. And thank you for attending. I know that many of you will have competing events today, and we're so pleased that you're able to be with us for what I think will be a really important and interesting discussion. For those of you I haven't met, my name's Dr. Lisa Eckstein, and I'm the Program Director for CTIQ. Today, we're going to be discussing the really interesting, important and timely issue of sharing clinical trial results with Australian participants. This was a component of the Beyond the Form project, which has been a 3-year-long collaboration between CTIQ and the VCCC Alliance to bridge the communication gap between participants and researchers in clinical research. I do want to acknowledge that I'm joining you today on the land of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation and pay my respects to the traditional owners, past and present, of this land, and extend those respects to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who are with us on the webinar today. I'm just going to check in. I could see that my colleague Gudrun had her hand up, so I'm just going to check to make sure there's nothing going on. No? Okay, good, Gudrun. I'm always conscious at the start of these webinars that there's an array of technical issues that can go wrong, and with my technical abilities, often that array is really limitless in terms of the things that can be challenging. But hopefully the technology is working for all of you. If you do face technology difficulties, please do feel free to email me at lisaeckstein@ctiq.com.au, and I'll do my best to help you out or point you in the right direction. So, what is the Beyond the Form project? It was founded on the premise that good communication supports a respectful and inclusive experience for participants and improves the efficiency of clinical research. But when I think about the Beyond the Form project, I always go back to its origin story. And please do forgive me if you've heard this before, but I think it's important to understand what this project set out to achieve and why it came into existence. About 3 years ago now, CTIQ and many of you on the call with us were in the depths of the Informed project, an effort to redesign and redevelop participant information and consent forms for Australian health and medical research. As any of you who've drafted PICFs might know, this was an extensive, detailed, time-consuming process. We had an incredible project team who met frequently and often for quite extensive periods of time to discuss the ins and outs of what were going to be in the template picks that we recommended to the sector. Towards the end of one of these meetings, one of our consumer members, the incredible Sarah Lukeman, for those of you who've met her, put her hand up and said, look, there's just something that's bothering me a bit. I understand why this is important. I agree that the time of consent is a really meaningful time. People need to be able to make decisions that align with their values and interests in terms of whether they participate in research. But for many of us, we'll participate in research for weeks, months, even years of our lives. And it's not just at that one moment of consent that communication is important. Communication has to travel throughout the period of clinical research and beyond. And so we developed the Beyond the Form project, which is designed to support clinical research teams in building strong, compassionate communication with participants throughout their research journey. A significant part of the project, and I'm sure my colleague Gudrun Wells will talk about it with you, was talking with past participants about their communication needs and preferences. And one topic came up again and again and again: the provision of trial results to participants at the end of a study. And so we wanted to take time to talk with all of you, our clinical research colleagues, about how we can foster good communication practices when it comes to sharing research results back at the end of a trial. We're going to have 4 people talk with you and share their perspectives before we move into some question time. We'll start with my colleague Gudrun Wells, who led this project. He'll tell you a bit more about the project itself. Our incredible consumer, Genevieve Handley, who'll give a participant's perspective. Angela Watt, who will give an HREC perspective. And finally, Sophie Seck, who will give a regulatory perspective. I'll give all their bios in more detail when we move into that component of the project, but I just wanted to give you a sense of what was coming up. Now, a couple of parameters I do want to be clear about before we move into the substantive part of the discussion, because this is a huge topic, the provision of clinical trial results at the end of a study. So just a few parameters. First of all, we're talking here about finalised clinical trial results. We're not talking about the equally important and vexed issue of the provision of interim study results to the participants or otherwise. Secondly, we're specifically focusing on the provision of results to those people who participated in the study. We're not dealing with, again, the important but somewhat different issue of the provision of trial results to the public at large when it comes to the end of the study. So hopefully we can keep that in mind to keep our discussion focused, because this is a big enough topic as it is. And so we did just want to set a few parameters for it. With that in mind, I'm going to, if technology permits, share my screen and lead you into some Mentimeter questions. So just give me one moment. Our incredible speakers. And hopefully now this will allow you to move to Mentimeter to answer just a couple of questions for us. So the first question that I wanted to get your sense check on is whether people should be able to access the results or outcomes of a clinical research project in which they've participated. And we're getting a pretty overwhelming response of yes, which I think is exactly what I and most of you would have anticipated. So let's now move to our next question for you. In your experience, are these results provided to participants in Australia? And here we're starting to see something much more mixed. We have a handful of people that are saying, yes, they're routinely provided to participants. A similar handful of people that are saying, no, they're not generally provided to participants. And the vast majority of people saying sometimes. And that's exactly the kind of ambiguity that we want to be able to explore with you today. So with that, to set the scene, I'm going to lead you in to our first presenter. Our first speaker today is my colleague Gudrun Wells, a research officer for CTIQ and a project leader for the Beyond the Form project. Gudrun's work focuses on improving the participant experience throughout research projects. She has a background in research governance and clinical trial coordination, and Gudrun is going to lead us off by giving some of the background for the webinar that we're having today. Over to you, Gudrun.
Thanks, Lisa. As Lisa said, this webinar came out of the Beyond the Form project, and in that project, we talked to a lot of different people. So we talked to researchers who were designing projects, We talked to the site staff who were carrying out those projects, and we talked to participants who were taking part. Similar to that Mentimeter that we just saw, a lot of the people, there were cases of people doing a great job of thinking about what the results of their trial were, how to present them, and getting them out to participants. But it was much more common to hear about people saying that they didn't receive those results. So that's both participants reporting that they didn't receive the results, and also site staff saying that they weren't shared the results to be able to send them on to participants. So I thought it would be good to first take a step back and talk through how this process is meant to work. So obviously the sponsor of the trial are the people who collect all the data and analyze that research data and generate the results of the study. They then publish and distribute these results, which may or may not include a lay summary. If the sponsor wants to send the results to participants, they'll usually need to send those results to site staff to distribute them, as sponsors don't usually have a way of contacting participants directly. And then, depending on the type of research and the type of results that have come out of the research, the site staff or the patient's medical team may then call the participants to discuss those findings, or they might send out a letter summarising the findings and letting them know where they might find more information. So a key point here is that both the sponsor and the site staff have really important roles to make sure that the participants receive any kind of results. So why is it that this process seems to fall down so often? So there's a few different reasons that have come up. Often there's a long time between when the participant involvement finishes and the results are ready for distribution. And in that time, the connection between the sponsor and the site staff might break down. Site staff often move on to different projects soon after the site has closed because they often work on short-term contracts. Additionally, if the lay summary was produced by an international sponsor, it might also need to be adapted to comply with Australian regulations. But if you look at the big picture, the main reason why this falls down is because there's not actually any requirement for it to happen, which means that the resources needed to create and distribute these results aren't prioritised. So I've mentioned regulation in Australia, and this is something that Sophie is going to talk about in more detail. But just to look at it from the big picture, trials in Australia are largely regulated by or guided in how they are constructed by the National Statement and the Therapeutic Goods Act. So the National Statement has a large focus on the recruitment and consent processes and the ethical considerations for how trials are designed. It does encourage the sharing of results of research projects with participants, but it doesn't require that this happens. So in turn, this means that sharing results is not specifically required by HRECs and RGOs. Their focus is much more on setting up the studies initially and then protecting participant safety during the research, which is something so Angela will talk some more about how HRECs work through all of that process. In Australia, sharing results is somewhat more complicated if you're working on a trial that involves unapproved therapeutic goods, as these are covered by the Therapeutic Goods Act and the Medicine Australia Code of Conduct, which specify that sponsors can't be seen to promote the use of unapproved therapeutic goods. So that means that if you were working on a trial like that, you need to think more carefully about how you would draft and share any results. But it's worth noting that those regulations around unapproved therapeutic goods don't apply to all types of clinical research. So there are lots of clinical trials out there that don't use those types of goods and other types of clinical research as well. So those ones aren't bound by that requirement. The other factor is that there aren't any consequences for researchers not sharing the results of their research with either the reviewing HREC or the TGA, or failing to record them on the Australian and New Zealand Clinical Trials Register. and there aren't any recommendations for how long after data collection has finished that this should be done. So this may all change with the development of the National One-Stop Shop, which I understand is going to involve a redevelopment of our clinical trial registry, but this is likely still quite a few years away. So the other thing that I wanted to touch upon is like how other countries deal with this issue. A lot of the commercial trials in Australia, I have American sponsors, and there is a requirement to report results depending on who the funders are. And if this is applicable, that needs to be done within a year of the study completing. In America, there may be many different portals that people use to post their results, and then participants can access these sometimes by using their study ID as the password to get in. But it's worth noting that in the US, pharmaceutical companies are allowed to promote their products directly to the public, which is a very different situation for what happens in Australia. And if we look to Europe, the situation there is that from the beginning of this year, trials that have medical intervention trials that are conducted in the EU must be registered in their clinical trials information system, which is similar to what is being proposed for the National One-Stop Shop, and includes a public portal where sponsors report their outcomes within 1 year of the trial completing, along with a lay summary of those results. So we can see that that it is possible to set up structures to encourage this sharing of results more consistently with participants, but that's not where Australia is right now. As I said at the beginning, there are researchers who are doing this work currently and doing a really great job. It was really interesting talking to people about some of the ways that they share their results and how they think through all of those considerations about how to write the summaries. So that's a bit of a setting of like where we're at currently, and I'll pass back to Lisa at that point.
Thank you so much for that, Gudrun. It's so great to get that scene setting and the real background as to why we decided to have this webinar and to really bring home the reasons why study results might want to be provided to participants. We thought it was really important to have a past participant here to talk about what the provision of study results meant to them. And I'm so pleased to be able to welcome to the webinar Genevieve Handley, who has lived experience with cystic fibrosis, Australia's most common fatal genetic condition. From a young age, she's participated in multiple clinical trials. As a passionate advocate for research and access to latest treatments, combined with her expertise in biomedical science and physiotherapy, she continues to be highly engaged in the outcomes of these studies. In other words, the perfect person for us to have at this webinar. Thank you so much for joining us. Jen, I'll put you on the screen.
Thanks, Lisa. As someone who lives with cystic fibrosis, a life-shortening genetic condition which affects multiple organs, in particular the lungs and digestive system, I've been very fortunate to have been involved in quite a few clinical trials. These trials have varied from trials run by health professionals at my local hospitals, to observational Australian and international studies, to interventional studies with new medicines. Throughout all of these studies, I have never been informed about the study outcome. As someone who has a background in biomedical science and physiotherapy, I am particularly interested in the clinical trial results, and I've always searched for the outcomes myself. Sometimes these can be accessed in press releases or published articles, but often this information is very difficult to find. There are barriers such as articles not being free, articles taking a while to be published, or perhaps the results not being published at all. For those who do not have a scientific or health background, it would be even harder to find and potentially understand this information. From speaking to some of my friends in the CF community, they rely on information shared by CF organisations and through support groups on social media. There is one example that particularly comes to mind. This involved trialling a new medicine treating the underlying cause of CF. Throughout the trial, I knew my lung function had improved, and I hoped this would mean the medicine was a success. After the trial, a reasonable amount of time passed with no news online, and I even emailed the drug company to find out more. They were not able to provide any information, but I heard rumours from other participants that they had problems during the trial, and eventually we heard the development of the medicine had been discontinued due to toxicity concerns. As you can imagine, this was somewhat alarming, in particular as we were not informed about this development when the news was released. Once known and publicly available, ideally this information should be conveyed to the participants, allowing those involved in their healthcare to be informed about any safety concerns. As a member of the community, where until recent years, life-threatening complications were very common by the age of 30, trials that involve new medicines are particularly exciting for our community, and we eagerly await the results of medicines that could dramatically change our lives. Ideally, the clinical trial results would be provided to participants in an easily accessible format, with both a plain language summary as well as the detailed scientific findings for those who wish to read the results in full. Ideally, this would involve the medical team allowing for an explanation and ensuring any questions could be answered, and also be available online, assisting those involved to be able to access this information easily. A benefit of obtaining the clinical trial results is being able to make decisions about my healthcare in conjunction with my healthcare team. The trial results can provide further information about potential treatment options that may work best for you, influencing your current and future management. An example in this space would include potentially waiting for a future treatment rather than starting an extra treatment now, looking at the overall situation in terms of potential side effects and benefits. Basically, the more information we have from as many sources as possible, the better our healthcare will be. Lastly, and potentially most importantly, providing results to participants shows respect for their contribution to the research and provides participants a sense of contribution towards the research. Knowledge about future treatments provides both useful information for health management and, importantly, provides hope for the future. Clinical trials can often be quite time-consuming, involving multiple days off work, travel, and additional treatments, potentially for a year or longer. And there are also many potentially invasive tests involved. Ensuring the experience is positive, in particular with the results being shared in a timely manner, would encourage future participation in clinical research, helping to advance medical care at a faster rate. Thanks, Lisa.
Thank you so much for that, Jen. That was so inspiring to hear. So hopefully now with Jen's comments resonating in all of your minds, it is an opportune time to bring to the webinar stage our next speaker, Dr. Angela Watt. Angela has brought a broader community perspective to the Royal Melbourne Hospital Human Research Ethics Committee since July 2022, after retiring from her role at Royal Melbourne Hospital Director of Research Governance and Ethics, a position she held for more than 30 years. Angela holds a BSc and PhD in Immunology from the University of Melbourne and a Grad Dip in Health Services Management from RMIT. As anyone who knows her can attest, Angela has a strong interest in and commitment to supporting, promoting and facilitating world-class clinical research undertaken in accordance with the highest standards of research merit, integrity and bioethics. Respecting and protecting research participants, people who volunteer to take part in research and without whom excellent research would not be possible, is central to ensuring that all human research is ethically good research. And a key aspect of the ethical principle of respect is providing research participants with information about the outcomes of the research in which they take part. So with all of that, I would invite Angela to take us through some ideas about how HREX could work to promote the return of results to participants. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Lisa. Can you hear me? Yep. Right. Well, I think what we've just heard from Jen has just cemented what I've always thought about how important it is to acknowledge, value and respect people who are research participants. I think that, as Jen said, people feel good knowing that they've made a contribution to medical knowledge to the greater good, and to obviously potentially helping others and improving the health of others in the future who've got the same condition. And, and I think, as we also heard, especially in the case of people who've got a very serious illness, participation in a clinical trial, even a first in humans early phase trial, there's always, I think, deep down a glimmer of hope that the participation in that trial might actually help them. But I think that most people I've spoken to, it's about themselves, but also very much a spirit of altruism, hoping that through their suffering and their contribution, they can make a difference for the better to others in the future. And I also think that providing research results helps improve the overall perception of research in the public sphere. And in addition to providing results directly to participants, I think there also needs to be more public dissemination of research results through the media, notwithstanding what the code says for Medicines Australia. And research results should always be offered in the form of a comprehensible and understandable, informative, plain English summary. And they need to be worded very carefully to maximise understanding and convey appreciation. They should try as much as possible to emphasise the positives, even if a study has negative results. And the wording of summaries should try as much as possible to minimise wording, even if the study has negative results, to minimise wording that can cause distress. Especially if, the study drug's been abandoned, participants are still seriously ill even after the end of the trial. And of course, negative results also do carry with them a risk of harm. And this is, when I was preparing for this seminar, it had never occurred to me that providing summaries of research results could actually cause harm. I thought automatically, it's a good thing and everyone should be sent the results. But of course, having, especially through, the reading I did for this seminar, of course, receiving the results necessarily isn't always harmless. And there can be potential harms, most of which are usually kind of emotional type harms. For like having to relive a difficult time in your life, or learning that you participated in an inferior arm of a trial. An example of this that our own committee reviewed recently was a study involving pregnant women and their babies, both during the pregnancy and after birth. And it was a really worthwhile study which aimed to establish a registry for a serious condition, which the name just horrified me, unfortunately, hemolytic disease of the fetus and newborn. I mean, how important would it be to try and improve the condition of this, this sort of thing, and families affected by it? But, on the other hand, the potential distress that might be caused for the people in the study by the simple act of gathering information could also be massive. And, so we do have to think about whether people want or don't want to receive research results. So, in terms of what are some ways that we could respectfully manage providing research results to participants, whether it's a plain English summary, plus or minus links to scientific publications, I think participants should be offered the opportunity to make an informed choice about whether to receive or not research outcomes. I think that's probably the best option. And the onus is on researchers to offer a summary of the results. And when they're doing this, also to present what possible harms and benefits there could be from receiving the results, and if possible, to arrange and provide appropriate subsequent support for people who might need this. I think as an HREC member that the option to consent to receive results should be offered to every participant at the time they initially consent to take part in a research study. It could be a simple yes/no tick box that's added to the PICF consent form. And a process of consent for receiving research results ensures that providing the results is not a forced paternalistic act, but rather a considered decision which takes into account potential benefits, but also potential harms. And, ideally, participants can indicate whether they want receive the results through an email or a letter with a link to the results summary or to scientific publications, or simply just a plain old-fashioned piece of paper. And then also, you know, should we ask participants about receiving results again while they're actually participating in a study? And then again, at the time that their participation ends, you know, just to make sure they haven't changed their mind. You know, and ask people who have said no as well as people who've said yes. And even after a study is ended and results are available, you know, should we reach out yet again to people who said they didn't want to receive the results previously in case they've changed their minds many months or years later? Another consideration is how you'll share research findings with participants. You know, the format, text, email, letter, newsletter, website, and the timing that results will be provided. And also, I think we need plans about who is going to receive the findings, and that's particularly relevant if participants die or lose capacity during the course of the study, or if participants are children. And in many cases, it might be important to consider if family members should also be asked about receiving research findings at the same time points we ask competent adult participants. And I think researchers also need to think about who will communicate the findings. And I actually, after thinking about all of this, thought that this information could all go into the protocol, that there could be a sharing of research results plan, complete with helpful tips and guidelines for the writer, and that this could be an integral section of all research protocol templates. And then, you know, perhaps in terms of how we're going to resource all of this, maybe researchers can include a request for funding to share results in their research funding budget applications to sponsors or grant applications to funding bodies. Is this a legitimate and acceptable budget item? And using the research results sharing plan in the protocol, researchers also need to set out their plans for communicating the findings to participants in the PICF. I think participants need to be made aware of the likely timing of the communication so that they know when and how to expect the information. And then, you know, how can ethics committees work to promote returning research results, reliable returning of results? We could offer educational sessions for researchers with HREC members and potential participants and consumers to discuss preparing and communicating results. I think this would go a long way towards promoting trust and awareness, mutual respect and understanding. But, you know, as I alluded to, right now, you know, there just is no money. Resourcing is a major issue in all of research. And if you add that to the time elapsed between the end of a study and the release of results, to personnel and other changes in organisations, these things are all stumbling blocks to ever being able to guarantee that research results will actually be provided reliably to participants when they become available after many months to many years. You know, and add all of that to the fact that some studies may also run for many years, and the task becomes even more challenging. I know that there are some longitudinal studies which set up a system of newsletters to keep people informed about study progress, but again, this sort of thing may not suit all studies, and resourcing is an issue. And I mean, resourcing of HREC management teams in research offices is, you know, people just never are adequately resourced to do their jobs the way they would like to. And even with externally sponsored clinical trials, creating and sharing plain English summaries requires site as well as sponsor resources. You know, and often, again, because of this time elapsed and personnel and other changes, it can be really difficult to track whether a commitment to provide a research summary some years before has actually been met, especially if there's no proper system in place to manage this. And, you know, I think while researchers know they have to and mostly do submit annual reports every year to their reviewing ethics committee and their governance office. In my 34 years at the RMH, I haven't seen many late summaries at all. Maybe as an ethics committee member or someone in the research office, maybe 10. You know, I mean, I'm just making that up. I just don't know. And then who is actually responsible for preparing these research summaries? Is it the researchers? Is it the hospitals they work in? Is it ethics committees? Is it sponsors? And, you know, we heard before, Gudrun mentioned the Medicines Australia. You know, I'm really surprised that from my reading of the National Statement and the Australian Code, I haven't been able to see any sections discussing responsibilities of trial sponsors. And they are a major party with responsibility for clinical research. It's not all on organisations and researchers. And I think that's something I would like to see addressed. You know, so what can ethics committees do? We can create an additional requirement for approval of a study, that there's a signed commitment up front from the investigators to offer a plain English summary of the results. And maybe that commitment can also include a written plan about how they're going to do this that the ethics committee can approve in advance. Maybe we can, you know, ethics committees or the NH and MRC can help by preparing an SOP for everyone to use around the country to keep track of writing and distributing results summaries. And, you know, there could even be a question about providing research results on the annual report form. But, you know, annual report forms usually cease being provided once a study's completed or a data lock occurs, and the results are usually a long way off after that. You know, we might even be able to institute a requirement for approval of future applications from the same PI, that if they haven't submitted research results before, they're not going to get their new studies accepted for publication.
Angela, I'm just going to give you a tiny bit of time to wrap up because I'm just conscious that we need to get to the hour. Sorry.
No. But as I said, I haven't heard any promising suggestions about how this can be properly managed and resourced. There is, as Gudrun mentioned, a trial summaries website, a US website, which is really good. And I wonder whether maybe in Australia we could post trial summaries on the Australian Clinical Trials Registry, or maybe through the NH and MRC's national one-stop shop. And, you know, the other thing was, do HREX need to approve a plain language summary of research results before it's sent? I think they do. There's a current requirement for ethics committees to approve all participant-facing material before a study is approved, and we have to review and approve amendments. So are results patient-facing? Yes, they absolutely are. And, you know, ethics committees every ethics committee wants to put its spin on a PICF. Why should research results be less important than a participant information and consent form? You know, I don't know what it might depend, the requirement for an ethics committee to review. It might depend on what type of research project it is. But, you know, if they don't get any sort of review, we can't always guarantee the quality. Poor PICFs are not acceptable, so why should summaries of research results be allowed to be poor quality? Do research results not matter, or not matter as much as a PICF? What does thinking like that say for respecting participants and the merit and the integrity of the research itself? Thank you. Sorry it took so long. I'm very passionate about this.
No, not at all. It's great to hear those thoughts. I'm so loath to cut you off, but also aware that we still have one speaker to go and I want to have a little bit of time for questions. I can already see some really interesting thoughts and comments coming into the chat. So we'll bring that into the discussion. But before we do so, I want to welcome our final panelist to the webinar stage, Sophie Seck, Senior Manager of Ethics and Compliance at Medicines Australia. Her role is to not just administer the Code of Conduct, but also to support its application throughout industry and ensure conduct of industry in Australia remains of the highest ethical standard, so the environment in which we provide access to our medicines is sustainable and fair. Sophie is a senior leader with over 30 years of experience across various sectors, specialising in non-governmental organisations. Throughout her career, she's driven change and innovation through ethical leadership, strong stakeholder engagement, and a commitment to governance and compliance. Sophie, we're so thrilled to have you join us to talk about how the Medicines Australia Code of Conduct applies to sharing results with clinical trial participants, meaning those people who participated in the clinical trial that the results are for. Thank you so much, Sophie. I'll bring you to the stage.
Thanks, Lisa. And yeah, amazing thoughts, lots of ideas there, Angela. And yeah, really great to hear from Jen, clearly with both lived experience and that, you know, healthcare professional experience as well. Fantastic. So yes, I might just touch quickly lightly on the context, in particular scope of the Code of Conduct, just to lay the groundwork before I kind of talk a bit further about the reasons why we believe that sponsor companies can share clinical trial results with trial participants. So the Code of Conduct does not apply to clinical trial participants. Just to be clear, it applies to pharmaceutical companies that innovate, that drive and develop new medicines. So it is a code that applies to the sponsor companies ultimately. It is underpinned by the Therapeutic Goods Act and regulations, and it translates that broader regulatory environment into principles for the companies to ethically engage with their stakeholders. So the code itself is silent on whether a company can or cannot share clinical trial results with participants. So it neither permits it nor it prohibits it. And that silence is quite useful, right? It's not, ambiguity is not always a bad thing. So the silence actually invites a principles-based decision, which is guided by those code principles and the intent behind the code. So there are many reasons why we believe that it is ethical and it is possible for a sponsor company to share clinical trial results with its participants. And it's already been mentioned in the session prior by my fellow speakers that, you know, patients, as you would be aware, are central to the science, and they are also central stakeholders in the work that the pharmaceutical industry does. So we believe firmly that engaging with patients early and more often in the medicine life cycle should be acknowledged and should be pursued. We also know that clinical trial participants are not passive subjects. They are actively contributing to scientific progress and they deserve to be informed. And as Jen said, you know, by providing or being able to provide those results shows respect for their participation and their contribution to the research. So the code defines or uses a term called scientific exchange, and that term is not unique to Australia. It's an international term that's widely used in many other codes, similar codes to Medicines Australia Code of Conduct all around the world. And it refers to the legitimate exchange of medical and scientific information in a non-promotional manner, which concerns unregistered medicines or off-label use. And it's not limited to unregistered medicines and off-label use. It can also include medical and scientific exchange of information about registered medicines, for example. So in this term and in the code acknowledges that legitimate scientific exchange can occur between companies and relevant stakeholders. So that exchange is not necessarily limited or exclusive to that relationship between companies and healthcare professionals. It is clear to me that trial participants are a relevant stakeholder in this context, and therefore it allows companies to share or exchange those results or that science with the participants in the trial. But it doesn't so that's the high level. There are some further considerations that I think should be taken on board, not only by the sponsor companies, but also appreciated and acknowledged by the other stakeholders in our regulatory system. And that has already been referred to, that we as an industry cannot promote, nor do we wish to promote our prescription medicines to consumers. It doesn't matter if the medicine is registered or unregistered, or if it's off-label or on-label. If it's a prescription medicine, it cannot be promoted to consumers. And, you know, in one way, we need to appreciate that trial participants are still considered consumers under the Therapeutic Goods Act. So they are not the same as a healthcare professional. So therefore, information that is shared with consumers, and in this case, we're talking about trial participants, should not promote that product. So that also means that it should not, that information should not be likely to influence patient-led prescribing. And communicating results, especially if they're positive, like I'm really kind of gearing towards that scenario, if they're positive efficacy results, then that data could convey the positive attributes of the product. And that therefore could end up being perceived to be promoting that product. So that's just it doesn't mean you cannot do it. It just means that it's a perception, and it means that the way in which that information shared needs to be very carefully thought through. Plain language summaries are encouraged. So the code itself does talk about providing relevant information to appropriate stakeholders appropriate to their role. That means that you know, that heavy scientific data that might be meaningful to an experienced healthcare professional might not be appropriate for a patient who might not have that medical and scientific background. That's the beauty and the magic of plain language summaries. The code also talks about a focus on two-way exchange. So in that way, it encourages that the companies provide the opportunity for participants to ask questions and to talk through and exchange information about that data that they're receiving, rather than, you know, here's a piece of paper, set and forget. And I think my colleagues also talked about accessing and being available for questions and answers, and being able to ensure that the information that's being provided is understood, and it's an exchange of information, not a one-way flow. The other aspect to appreciate is limitations on use. So participants, yeah, we just touched on this before, they just should understand that the information is being provided to them as they are trial participants. And it's not necessarily being provided to them for them to post on their social media platforms and public posting. So that kind of understanding of the role that each plays in this exchange of information mitigates the risk not only to sponsor companies but also to the individual receiving that information, that they are not participating in the promotion of prescription medicine. And a couple of other points before I finish. The code, I should say sponsor companies, they have the freedom to decide, as has been mentioned by Gudrun. Like, sponsor companies can choose how and whether to share results. So there is no mandated approach. To my knowledge, there is no current legal or code obligation that forces or mandates the sharing of trial information with participants. But on the flip side, there is definitely nothing from a code perspective and from our understanding of the Therapeutic Goods Act and regulations that would prevent a company from sharing in an ethical and responsible way the results with the participants themselves. And taking that one step further, we do have some Medicines Australia guidance that's been designed for companies to be able to communicate ethically with patients and their organisations. That does affirm, it advises against the public dissemination of trial results, but it does support private appropriate communication with trial participants. So we have gone that extra step to put that down in writing. And that's all from me, Lisa. I hope that helps.
Thank you so much, Sophie. That was so informative, and I'm sure will be really useful guidance for many of our CTIQ members and the broader clinical research community on the line. So with that, I am going to take you back to Mentimeter for a final question, which I'll share on the screen before we have just a couple of minutes for Q&A. I have seen a lot of your comments in the Q&A, so please apologies in advance if we don't get to get through all of them, but we'll do what we can. Okay, so instructions for getting back to Mentimeter. And now I wanted, after all of our 4 speakers' insightful presentations, to get views from you on what do we need to move forward with this work in Australia? How is it that we're going to be able to make progress in this really challenging space? So I'm seeing here already some suggestions for funding and resourcing, which is always really important. Clear guidelines and accessible advice, staff and budgets, templates approved by ethics committees and supported by sponsors, and of course, patient involvement as a must-have rather than nice to have. Again, funding. I saw a comment in the Q&A earlier about this issue of needing to maintain contact with sites and principal investigator, given often the time this is happening. The HREC has already closed off the study. Guidance for sponsors, clear guidance, collaboration. Thank you. These are all incredibly helpful and important comments, and we'll make sure to collate them and do what we can to push this issue forward with what's needed to ensure that participants are able to access the results of studies in which they participated. So with that, I will move to a couple of Q&As for our panellists. So I'll bring all of our panellists onto the screen. And the first one that I wanted to ask of people, which came from a couple of different questions we received in advance, is how do we go about sharing results with participant groups that have characteristics that might make it harder to share the information? So one of the questions talked about oncology patients, potentially with low survival rates. One of the questions focusing on people living with dementia that might have cognitive decline during the course of the study. So I might start with Jen, if Jen is able to give any insights from a consumer perspective as to what she thinks would be useful in these contexts, and then any of our panelists who want to add on to Jen's comments.
Yeah, thanks, Lisa. I think it would be relevant across quite a few different areas. It's the timeliness, especially if people are quite unwell. It's about getting that information to them as quickly as possible. Definitely involving the healthcare team so that things can be explained in a two-way conversation. And definitely looking at that lay summary looking at that wording as much as possible to explain it in language appropriate, especially if it's, as you mentioned, dementia, or even say with children as well. There's some very different language that would be useful across those groups.
And can I just add to that, Lisa, what I said before? I mean, I think you need to think about this at the onset of a study and talk to the participant plus their as well, about who in their family they would like to receive this communication in the event that, somebody does pass away or lose capacity, because I think it's just as important for the families who go through the journey with the participant.
Yeah, that's such an important comment, Angela, and really fits with guidance in the Beyond a Form project more generally about having communication plans from the outset. Okay, the next question, which I might direct to Angela and to Sophie, is whether there's a template or recommended structure for clinical trial summary documents.
Sophie, I don't know if there's, I don't know of a template.
I'm not an expert in that, but there are. It's not. I would suggest, sitting from my perspective, and I know how this. There are so many plain language summaries out there that are accessible to us internationally. As Angela mentioned before, she mentioned a US site, so we do have the benefits of cross-regional internet access, and I just don't think it's. I think there would be one out there, and I think that there's many great ones to draw from. But I don't have one at my fingertips. Angela, do you have anything to add to that?
No, only that along with the template and some guidelines, I really think a system or a platform, and I saw that comment, and I think that an easy way to make it happen for everybody, as well as the templates, would be really helpful. An
Just
easy
as far
process.
as-
Yeah.
Just as far as templates go, I do know that the ACTA and CTIQ Consumer Involvement Engagement Toolkit has some sort of templates for both a general lay summaries and a template for working with commercial summaries. So that is something that was developed in an Australian context. I'm also going to choose this opportunity as a plug for the Beyond the Form Toolkit, which just got launched last week. And that has a section in it sort of looking at resources for people drafting those lay summaries as well.
Thanks, Gudrun, and I'm so glad you got the plug for the toolkit in there. Please do go. There's a huge number of resources in there and particular focus on communication plans. Okay, I'll finish. And again, apologies, I haven't got into everything in here, but I have a comment here from Nicole Humphreys saying, as a site, we've requested plain English summaries of results from the sponsor who, for all the barriers you've mentioned, are unable to provide summary. Is it possible for something to be developed at a site level? So maybe Sophie and any other panelists, how would you feel about sites developing something if sponsors don't do it themselves?
I'll just start quickly. It really doesn't matter too much as long as the sponsor company has oversight of the material that's being provided about their science. So if the issue is actually resourcing and the site level, do you know what I mean, stepping up or providing that service as such, or that extra layer of responsibility, there's nothing preventing that from happening. But yeah, the sponsor company just needs to have control over what information is provided about their science and delivered in a way that's ethical and in line with, the regulatory environment in which we work. Angela, do you agree with that? Any additional?
No, I absolutely agree. And I was just thinking too, another reason for making sure that the sponsor also knows is to make sure that the interpretation is correct. If you have researchers reading publications or writing plain summaries as a result of a conference presentation, you'd want to make sure that it was correctly understood and interpreted before it was communicated to participants.
Yeah, I think that's a really great and important comment. I am aware that we have neatly wrapped up at 2 p.m. on the dot from that question. So I will leave us there with a huge gratitude to Jen Handley, Sophie Seck, Angela Watt and Gudrun Wells as our panellists today. Thank you to all of you who have joined us for this. We really appreciate you spending the time with us. And I hope you continue to have a great International Clinical Trials Day. Thank you so much.
Thank you.